Have you ever wondered what are the worst albums by your favorite metal bands? I did, and that's why I decided to make this Iceberg chart to show you the worst mistakes by the most popular bands out there. And the further we go down, the more brutal the drops are. Some of these albums caused that the band members quit, and sometimes they even got dropped from their labels. This video will get funny fast, trust me. This time the rules are quite simple. First of all, one album per band, because I don't want 3 metallic albums on this chart. And like always, I try to include a wide variety of metal genres this time. Before we dive in, I'm Snorky, and if you want to see more videos like this, consider subscribing to the channel. And with that said, are you ready to explore the worst albums by your favorite metal bands? Slipknot, the end so far. Slipknot's place in the heavy metal music is massive. They are one of those bands who broke into the mainstream without changing the formula. The fans or the maggots will eat everything up that Slipknot produces. This one was a bit hard to swallow. By the time this album dropped, the band was in a very strange place. 2 of the most important members were gone, Paul Gray and Jordanson, and that loss was felt, and the chemistry of the band definitely changed. And some fans even argue that this album was basically wrapping up their contract with Roadrunner Records. Because if you decide to listen to this album, you're not hearing a band that is opening up a chapter, but closing one. The opening song, Adderall, threw everybody off. Because it simply doesn't sound like a Slipknot record, but more like a Corey Taylor song which somehow landed on this album. And it would be easy to say that every album has that one weird song, but it doesn't stop there. The real problem is the overall vibe of the album, and it feels more experimental than it should be. Like they were trying things to see just what sticks. There are definitely some solid moments in the album, but nothing seems as visceral as you expect from Slipknot. Instead of a hard-hitting album, everything just flows around, and until you reach the end of the album, you are left unsatisfied. And later Corey said that the whole band was emotionally burned down, and you can definitely hear that on this album. But there are still very good tracks on this song, like the Dying Song and Yen. In 2022, I was on their tour when they promoted this album, and when the Dying Song came on, it definitely moved the crowd. But the critics weren't so thrilled, and the album received around 70 out of a 100 score. Rob Zombie, Venomous Rat Regeneration Vendor. Rob Zombie is one of those artists who truly stands out, and he isn't just a musician, but he's a whole universe. And if you look at Rob Zombie, between his music, movies and his visual direction, he doesn't lack talent in any direction. And if you don't know, he was the mastermind behind House of Thousand Corpses, Halloween's remake, and The Lords of Salem.
In heaven.
And for people in my age, his presence on the PlayStation 1 was quite huge. And over the decades he spent on the music scene, he delivered some hard-hitting albums like Hellbilly Deluxe. But when 2013 hit and this album came out, things started to smell weird. It's not just because Rob Zombie was dressing like a hobo, but his style isn't everybody's cup of tea, because some people don't enjoy this mix of industrial, horror-themed carnival vibe. But the problem was that this album sounded like a cheap copy from the rest of his work. Part of this could be timing, because he released this album when Lords of Salem was filmed, and you can simply feel that the focus wasn't there. The album itself isn't bad, but it feels very predictable. The riffs aren't memorable and the songwriting felt very thin. And honestly, the electronics and the effects are doing the heavy lifting this time. There are definitely tracks that stand out, like A Rock and Roll in a Black Hole. It has a hard-hitting bass with a hypnotic rhythm guitar, and is one of the most listened songs on YouTube from this album. But my personal favorite was definitely The Girl Who Loved the Monsters. It's the most Rob Zombie track on this whole album. And here's a little snippet so you can just feel the vibe of the song. But overall, I feel that the album is simply missing something. Even the lyrics on this album sound like somebody pulled out some random quotes from a hat, and one reviewer from AllMusic summed it up perfectly, saying that the album feels like a concept you need real patience to piece together, patience only die-hard fans would have. Tool Opiate. "Religion is the opiate of the masses." A quote from a bearded guy. And ironically, here we're talking about Tool Opiate. And at this point, I'm truly thinking the Tool is stalking me. This is the second video that showed up on my channel, and I hope this doesn't become a pattern. So why does Opiate get so much hate? The answer is quite simple. Lazarus, Anima or 10,000 Days, and then go back to Opiate, it feels like something is missing. Because this is a very early Tool album, and if you go back you will not hear this cryptic, progressive, hyper-layered stuff they will do later on in their library. So when you compare Opiate with all the albums that came afterward, it's obvious why it's lacking. It's not because it's a bad album, but it's more straightforward, with less experiments and more simple lyrics. Most reviews sit around 3 out of 5 stars, and again, it's not a bad record, but it's just very normal. Or Life is Peachy. The one who thinks life is peachy can go peach himself. Snorky 2025. Now Korn's first album hit the scene like a bomb, and you can argue basically if they invented a whole genre. And when Korn announced they are producing a second album, everybody was hyped. But Life is Peachy is definitely a mixed bag. Now the story behind this album goes, they were recording it while they were having free time, because they were constantly on tours and partying all the time. And when they have some free time, they will jump into the studio and try to make a track. Rob Robinson for this time wanted to use a very raw and unpolished style, and they definitely achieved that. The downside is that the first album sounded raw, but this one sounded unpolished. And when you start to listen to the album, you will hear jumps in quality, but also how the instruments are sounding, with many people complaining how the bass is sounding very clunky. And then comes the vibe of the album. In 1 minute you get these heavy chaotic tracks, and in the second minute you will get tracks like Adidas that are more on the goofy side. Many critics stated that Jonathan Davis sounded more whiny but less emotional on this record than on the previous one. But here's the twist. Life is Peachy still debuted number 3 on the Billboard 200, so no, it's not a disaster by any means, but it's definitely not a high point in their discography, and that's why it landed on layer 1 of this Iceberg. I also wanted to include Korn 3, Remember Who You Are, but then again I said I will only have 1 album per band. Killswitch Engage, self-titled. Do we have any metalcore fans here? And if so, you probably know that Killswitch Engage helped to shape the whole genre. The End of the Heartache wasn't just a hit, it was basically a blueprint. And then came As Daylight Dies and My Curse, and the band just keep climbing. And that's where their self-titled album feels a step in the wrong direction. Self-titled albums are usually supposed to be these big statements. Like this is their masterpiece. But this completely backfired on this one. Now Howard Jones sounded incredible on this album. This was never like the issue, but more like everything around him was. And I think that the timing of this album made it worse, because at the time there were many metalcore bands popping out from every side, because every band at the time had these clean choruses with melodic hooks, and Killswitch Engage didn't feel like unique anymore. They were surrounded by copycats, and instead in stepping forward they blended with the crowd. And that's the biggest problem with this album, I think, with fans criticizing that the album sounds very predictable and safe, and because the producer of the album wanted to hear more hardcore singing than screaming, it leaned even more to the mainstream. And that's the problem with this album. It isn't that bad, but it feels more generic than it should be, and this shift simply didn't sit right with many fans. The album still debuted at number 7 on the Billboard 200, but reviews were mixed across the board. But we are just getting started. Let's go to layer 2. Avenged Sevenfold, Hail to the King. Oh, we gotta talk about this one, don't we? So let me tell you a small secret. Avenged Sevenfold was the band that actually truly pulled me into metal. I know there are worse ways to start your metal journey, but there are also better ones. The albums that truly hooked me were City of Evil and Nightmare. So when Hail to the King was announced, I was truly expecting something epic. And at first I listened to this album, I felt like I'm not quite sure if I love this band anymore. After the drummer Rev passed, Avenged Sevenfold were a strange place emotionally, and the shift on this album was quite prominent. They definitely lost their long solos and they were not chaotic as they used to be. Everything sounded more cleaner, simpler and more safe. And then we have the song This Means War. At first I loved the song, but then something felt off. And then I realized that the intro was basically Sad But True by Metallica, with a Sevenfold paint on it. And once you hear it, it's impossible to unhear it. This is also when the fanbase split. People weren't upset that the album was unlistenable. They were more upset because Sevenfold lost the edge and sounded like a Metallica tribute band. And almost all traces from the metalcore chorus were basically gone. But to be fair, they openly said they wanted a more traditional metal record, and they definitely achieved that. It's not a bad album, it's just a bad Sevenfold album, especially if you grow up on their earlier sound. But I'll give credit when it's due. Coming Home still hits incredibly hard. I absolutely love that song. And of course, Hail to the King was a massive radio hit. Critics leaned more to the positive sides, but the fans were nearly so happy. Trivium, Vengeance Falls. I want to be perfectly clear for this entry. Even if I don't know much about Trivium, I still respect them. I'm not pretending to be some walking metal encyclopedia. To your surprise, I didn't heard every metal record that was made under the sun. Part of the things I talk about are from the things I already know, and the rest, like this Trivium record, is basically me sitting down, listening to the record and researching stuff. So when I pressed play for the first time on this album, without any background info, my first thought was literally, why does Matt sound like David Draymond? Of course, 2 minutes later I found out that David was the producer on this album and suddenly everything made sense. His fingerprints were everywhere and not in a subtle way. His vocal patterns, his phrasing and this ultra polished production felt so disturbed. There are moments where Trivium shines through, like in the song Strife, which is definitely one of the high points of the album. And then suddenly the autotune creeps in and you're simply feeling that something is lacking in this album. Compared to In Waves, which was much more sharper and heavier, Vengeance Falls feels like a massive drop down. And I couldn't get into this record at all because some styles can't be copied. That's why I never got into bands who try to copy Korn, because you can't copy Jonathan Davis' strange noises. They only work when he does them. The same thing with Disturbed. Judas Priest, Turbo. Now Judas Priest is one of the foundations of heavy metal, so seeing them on this list feels a bit strange. But honestly, so was the Turbo Lover era. By the mid-80s, glam on hair metal was like everywhere, and labels also tried to push them very hard so that the band landed into the mainstream. So when Judas Priest decided to have lighter riffs and include synths into their music to be more acceptable for a friendly MTV image, fans weren't happy. With time. So basically Rob admitted that he wasn't at his best at this time and he was dealing with heavy substance abuse. Rob, the singer, later admitted he wasn't very proud of this record and they abandoned their usual dark themes they would have in their songs and they would go for a more love lust partying style for this record. And to many longtime fans at the time this was very juvenile. It's actually a quite fun 80s album, but again the problem was it didn't sound like Judas Priest. It felt more like a glam metal band that took their name and had a little party over the weekend. And if you grew up on albums like Screaming for Vengeance or Electric Eye, this definitely feels like a shock. But still, Turbo Lover brought new audience to Judas Priest, and the album went even platinum in the USA. So clearly something worked, but again, the album received 60 out of 100. I can't say that I disliked the album, but then again, I wasn't around in 1986. So what the hell I know of how big of a betrayal this album was to the true metal fans back then. Because the first time I heard their songs, it was in 04 when I was playing at Hawaii City, so... Anthrax, Stomp 442. I love me some good thrash metal. I love to blast Slayer while working out. Man, Anthrax, I simply can't. I don't know why. I never connected with their music, and now we are looking at the worst part of their music history, because this album was considered when they hit rock bottom. First I went completely blinded to this album, and it was so immediate that I jumped on the grunge bandwagon at the time. And you can hear these hints of alternative and groove metal mixed in. It was basically like throwing things at the wall and see what sticks. From what I have read later on, they were going like through identity crisis at the time, and it definitely shows in this album. This was the second album produced with John Bush, and his first appearance was on Sound of the White Noise, which was actually pretty well received as I figure out. But by the time they released this album, they simply shifted too much to groove metal that it didn't feel like Anthrax anymore. I even saw Anthrax live once and I thought maybe it will click, but it didn't. And after this album it certainly didn't. And when you listen to this album, you truly feel that the band wasn't comfortable with their style. It's not an unlistenable record, but it's definitely not something I would listen in my free time. Critics were completely mixed on this one, and they received around a 50 out of a 100. Burzum Anskiptar. If you never encountered a Norwegian wizard called Vard Vikernes, you're missing out. His story deserves a whole video on its own, but that's something that we'll get later into. But here's the short version, okay? He burned churches, stabbed his best friend 23 times in self-defense, and somehow he still lives in his own pocket universe. And honestly, his music does reflect that. Burzum's early work definitely inspired the second wave of black metal. Tracks like Dunkelheit or Behold the Daughters of the Firmament feel like stepping into a completely other world. And even the prison albums weren't so bad. But Omniscript is, I don't know how to describe it. By this point, Varg already released like 10 albums across 2 decades, and Omniscript feels like the point where the quality was dropping off because of the quantity. And I mean, look, I enjoy black metal like the next guy, as you could figure it out lately, but Burzum's work is definitely overshadowed by all the things Varg is doing in the background.
Africa? Hello, how are you doing? You're hungry? Well, I think I have a solution. I have a big shipment of watermelons coming your way. I heard you guys like watermelons.
So sitting through this album was quite a drag. Putnik's music Kyle completely nailed it by saying an odd bastardization of the usual black metal sound. The whole record was built around poems from the Old Norse poem Voluspa. And instead of turning this poem into an atmospheric album, you basically got Varg speaking those words just aloud, like reading out a poem, half shouted with slow guitars in the background, and like again and again through the whole album. Look, give me blast beats, tremolo picking, and someone screaming like their nails are being ripped off. And I'm good, but this album doesn't have anything of that. It's flat, it's empty, and it's long for the sake of being long, I think. What made it even worse, because for whatever reason I decided to listen to Rotting Christ before I listened to this album. And when I see their production and atmosphere and compare it to Omniscript, it's like going from an orchestra to a one guy screaming something in his basement in the middle of nowhere. And it generally feels like Varg produced this album only to get a quick buck on Amazon.
Stop watching porn.
Mayhem, Grand Declaration of War. You know that one guy that Varg stabbed in self-defense? Yeah, that was Anonymous, and he was actually a guitarist of this band, a real pioneer of black metal whose life was cut short, sadly. Mayhem is one of those bands who definitely define Norwegian black metal, and their fingerprints are definitely all over the black metal scene. And plus, their history is full of chaos and crimes that only fuel the flame. But once you push past the shock factor, the music itself is actually very strong. and then Grand Declaration of War happened. This is one of the most polarizing black metal albums ever made. The title and the lyrics are directly pulled from Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, which is already a warning sign that this Mayhem album is perhaps a bit different than the previous ones. Some call it a genius album and others say it was the moment when the band completely derailed. And if you go from the brutal Death Crush album to the cold bitterness that was felt in the mysterious Dom Satanas album, your brain will completely break after hearing this one. At least that was my reaction, because I thought, what the hell just happened here? Mayhem decided to ditch their raw necro production they used to have on their previous albums and went for something more clean and more cynical. The album doesn't feature any proper black metal screams, but more like spoken words. And I mean, there are moments where Mayhem is shining through, but those moments are getting buried very fast. Listen to the song A Blood Sword and a Colder Sun. I mean, would you even guess that this was the same band that made Freezing Moon? I mean, they didn't just experiment with this one, they completely went into another dimension. It's ambitious for sure, but ambition doesn't automatically mean it's something enjoyable. Critics somehow loved it, giving it a 70 out of a 100, but fans were more mixed about this one. And I get why, because the band simply didn't feel like Mayhem anymore. And when you are one of the most influential black metal bands out there, this hits quite hard. Meshuggah, Catch 33. Meshuggah built their career on heavy chugs and very weird rhythmical choices, and their song structures are so weird they will throw you out of balance. Over time they became one of the most influential metal bands in the last 30 years. And the whole gent movement and chugging basically exists because of Meshuggah, and they achieved a huge underground following because of that. This list isn't about the moments of glory, but this video is about the albums who are kept in the closet. Now the idea behind this album is quite interesting. They decided to make a one 47-minute long track, which is split in 13 parts. Even if the structure sounds interesting, it completely punishes every casual listener, because if you decide to skip on anything, the whole momentum falls off. And a lot of critics said the exact same thing. Without any traditional verses and choruses or clear dynamic riffs, it's just feeling like the record is dragging you through something and you're not knowing where you're heading at. And we also have the problem with the drums, because Thomas Hake was injured at the time. Band heavily relied on heavy processes drum kit called Drum Kit from Hell. Even if the programming was quite complex, you can still hear it's not a human being. And when you build your whole identity on this impossible but human precision, taking the human part out of it isn't a good idea. And if you're not already into the Meshuggah style of or time signatures and the strange structures of their songs, this album will leave you exhausted. And even their most loyal fans still say that this is a technical exercise. And that's why many people think this is the bottom of their discography. And at the end, it received just mixed scores across the board. AC/DC, Flick of the Switch. As someone who never clicked with AC/DC, no pun intended, this album felt hard to get through. AC/DC built their empire on consistency, big riffs, and screams from Brain Jones that could wake up a dead man. And growing up, older people would always assume they loved AC/DC because I'm a metalhead. And if a band gets that big that non-metal people know your name, you made it. And somehow you always feel like you know what you're getting when you listen to them. And Flick of the Switch might be the most AC/DC album out there, but not in a good way. The problem was that this album comes after Highway to Hell, Back in Black, and For Those About to Rock. 3 absolutely massive albums. And following those albums is quite impossible. And then came Flick of the Switch, which isn't a memorable album at all. It's like the band stripped away any heaviness they have, and the album sounds very flat and it's like the punch never hits. Fans and critics said the same thing. The riffs feel completely recycled, the hooks aren't memorable, and the whole thing sounds like AC/DC wanted to copy their older albums. And in the end, the album is just meh, receiving around 60 out of a 100 score. And that's why it landed on this Iceberg chart. I mean, it's not such a bad album, but it's lacking in every aspect that made AC/DC popular in the first place.
Superman 3. From Disney and Pixar, enter a world where anything is...
Before we go to the next layer, I want to be real with you. These videos take a lot of time. I'm talking about scripting, researching, editing, and with my broken English, I am literally filming this for 4 hours just to get it right. And I wish I'm kidding. And when you consider how much of AI slop is flooding YouTube's algorithm, we small creators get buried very fast. Your help matters more than you think right now. So if you enjoyed this Iceberg even a little bit, leaving a comment or a like will help me a lot. Thank you very much. Let's go to the Iceberg. Slayer, Diabolos in Musica. You know that I take every chance to talk about Slayer when I can, but this time is for all the wrong reasons. Now, by the late 90s, the Big Four was basically falling apart and they were all trying to get into the more mainstream stuff. But Slayer, well, they had a quite good run in the 90s, mostly staying persistent with their thrash metal sound. Until Diabolos in Musica came, and what happened was that they were bitten by the nu metal bug. The album dropped and the album cover is looking like somebody screenshot a snuff movie, and it still creeps me out every time I see it, because I don't like to see pale dark priests rising from the dark. But their music completely threw everybody off guard. Like, Slayer didn't go like full nu metal, but they definitely dipped their sound into their genre. They had lower C-sharp tunings, slower riffs, and Tom Araya wasn't screaming anymore but more like shouting, and they completely changed his style of vocals. But the worst part is that not all of the band members were appreciating the changes. Kerry King straight up said, "That's the one record I really paid not attention to because I was bitter about what kind of music was popular. It felt like Fred Boy stuff," and Jeff later stated he was experimenting with different tunings and songwriting. And the result was simply that Slayer didn't feel like Slayer, and for true Slayer fans, this was an insult. The album wasn't unlistenable, but it definitely lacked anything that made Slayer special. Just to remind you, this was the band that gave us Rain in Blood and South of Heaven, so when Diabolos in Musica landed, the gap between their peaks and this record is massive. Critics gave this album actually quite decent reviews, which is fun in hindsight. The problem was that the band members weren't thrilled about this album, and the fanbase was also not thrilled about this one. Now, to be completely clear, I don't hate this album at all, because I think that Diabolos in Musica feels like a breath of fresh air. It doesn't sound too generic, and they didn't went overboard with the nu metal style. And songs like Bitter Peace and Death's Hand are generally good in my opinion. But compared to what Slayer could do and had done, this one sits at the bottom for a reason. Bullet for My Valentine, Temper Temper. Bullet for My Valentine was one of the biggest metalcore albums in the 2000s. The Poison and Scream Aim Fire basically dominated the scene, and Matt's voice feels like the soundtrack for every teenager who is crying in the rain, pretending that life was an anime opening. Temper Temper dropped in 2013 and the reactions were rough. The biggest issue was that the band didn't sound like themselves. They completely tried to go mainstream with this record, the same thing that Avenged Sevenfold did with Hail to the King. You can still hear This Is Bullet for My Valentine, but it's pushed in a very safe, polished and generic direction, and you will quickly notice there is less screaming and more simple riffs. And then we have Tears Don't Fall Part 2. Now, it isn't a bad song by itself. To release a sequel to your most iconic track on this album feels a bit desperate. The fans didn't hate this track, but they hated what it symbolized. And that's a band that had identity crisis. They were simply too soft for the metalcore crowd, but not memorable enough to reach mainstream success. And this almost sits uncomfortably in the middle, and the lyrics of this album are so generic. Critics weren't impressed by this one, and the album scored around 60 on Metacritic. Machine Head Supercharger. Machine Head truly feels like that band that go through every phase they could over the years, and before Supercharger dropped they were already in hot waters because of the Burning Red, and the fans were simply not thrilled about rapping, dyeing hair and the eyeliner. But the band did receive a full nu metal makeover in the early 2000s. With the fanbase already split, the Supercharger album didn't help at all. The record sales were around 45,000 copies in the US, which is insanely low for a band like Machine Head. I saw Machine Head a few years ago, and growing up with nu metal, this era didn't offend me that much. But I absolutely get why people were disappointed with this album. Because when you start to comparing this album to the rest of the discography, it becomes quite obvious how far they drifted from the original sound. The production didn't help either, it was muddy, overcompressed and strangely lifeless. And then we go to the timing of the album, because it was released in October 2001, with their lead single called Crushing Around You, and a month before the Twin Towers fell, and suddenly a video featuring burning skyscrapers and a song called Crashing Around You doesn't sound like the best idea, and MTV completely pulled the plug on this one, killing any momentum that the album would get. Then they were dropped from Roadrunner Records, and the guitarist Arwell Luster left. Even Rob Flynn later admitted that this album didn't feel right at the time. And then when you think about it, they got pulled from MTV, their guitarist left, sales plummeted, and basically they were dropped from Roadrunner Records, and plus the cover of Hole in the Sky was terrible. But do yourself a favor and check out the cover by Iron Maiden Hollow Be Thy Name. That one actually kicks ass. Sepultura Nation. Now Sepultura after Max Calavera left is already a divided topic. You can feel that blow on the album Against, but you can feel it even heavier by 2009 when Nation came out. Band was completely in a midlife crisis at this point. Feels like they tried to prove everyone that they could go on without Max. But the problem was that they started experimenting so heavy that it backfired. Terry Green also got some backlash, but not because he's a bad singer. The problem was he was all over the place on this album. He tried different pitches, spoken word sections, and even some melodic parts, and none of them really landed like they should have. And critics even said he failed on every front. Commercially, the album struggled very hard. The label completely lost faith in them and didn't even bother to financing their music video. And I mean, if your label doesn't want to promote you, things are definitely looking rough. Metacritic gave this album around 69 out of 100, which isn't terrible on paper, but when you try to compare it with their last records, it definitely is a drop in quality. And if you're into heavier music, definitely check out Nailbomb by Max. Venom Possessed. Venom was definitely one of those bands that every parent feared in the 1980s. Possessed was the fourth album by Venom, released in April of 1985. And by this point the band dropped 3 albums that truly shaped the way how extreme metal look. Welcome to Hell, Black Metal, At War with Satan. Those records shaped black metal, thrash and even early death metal. Venom was definitely a chaotic and raw band, but in the most best possible way. Then Possessed came out, and it feels like the deal with the devil was broken off. Even if you call this record perhaps less aggressive than the previous one, this isn't the problem, the sound is. Production feels very low budget, but not in a classic raw authentic way, but it's more like we didn't have any more time to finish this record. The guitars feel thin, the drums feel hollow, and the whole mix is simply lacking any energy behind it. A lot of fans said the same thing. It's like the previous record, but with worse writing and worse quality. Venom built their name on pushing boundaries, but Possessed didn't push anything. And this album marked when Venom lost their spark. There are some bright spots on this album like Flytrap and Too Loud for the Crowd. At least in my opinion they are quite memorable, but they do not save the album at all. Even Kronos later admitted that Possessed sounded unfinished, and that's the thing that fans also quickly recognized. Also, the frictions inside the band were so terrible that eventually the guitarist Mantas walked away after they finished this album. Morbid Angel, I Elude Divinum Insanus. Morbid Angels are legends when it comes to death metal. Altar of Madness and Blessed Are the Sick didn't just shape the genre, they built it. So when the band announced they're having a comeback with David Vincent returning on vocals, fans were definitely hyped. This was supposed to be the moment when one of the most important death metal vocals came back to the original band. But this album delivered something completely different. And instead of Morbid Angels chaos, we instead got death growls combined with industrial techno. And nobody was prepared for this. Tracks like Ridiculed and Too Extreme sound more like reject demos from Rammstein than anything else. It wasn't just experimental, it was completely bizarre. Louisville Music News literally called it a failed experiment and compared it to Metallica's Saint Anger, and critics gave it 3 out of a 10 rating. What really bothered the fans is not that Morbid Angel tried something new, but it was like the album wasn't committing to anything. Half of it tried to be the old school Morbid Angel we all love, and the other half is sounding like Rammstein mixed with Marilyn Manson. And it truly feels like 2 albums are merged together. Even if Trey Azagot can't write a bad riff, this didn't save this album at all. And with that, let's go to the last layer. Pantera, Metal Magic. Now I know that many people don't like Phil Anselmo because of the things he did and said over the years, but honestly I'd rather deal with that mess than with Metal Magic. Pantera in the 90s was completely unstoppable. They brought raw energy to the metal that was unmatched at the time, but Metal Magic was definitely something. If you slap other band's name on this record and remind yourself that Vinnie Paul and Dimebag were literally teenagers, it starts making sense. I mean, Vinnie was 19 and Dime was 16 at the time, and their dad, Jerry Abbott, a country musician, was the producer of this whole thing. Once you know that, you're definitely looking at this album with different lenses, and you're thinking perhaps, okay, this is not bad for a bunch of kids. But when you put Metal Magic between Vulgar Display of Power and Far Beyond Driven, the gaps become insane. The first time I tried to listen to Pantera's discography, I obviously wanted to try it from the start. I was completely baffled and I genuinely thought I clicked on the wrong band. The glam metal, the cheap vocals, the 80s cheesiness was like all over it. But once they blew up in the 90s, they completely forgot about the first 4 albums they made. And with a good reason, I think. And maybe it's a little bit unfair, Phil wasn't there, they were still very young and this was their first album, but even with that in mind, the score of this album floats around a 30 out of 100. And it's one of those moments that context truly helps you to understand what this album was, but it still doesn't save it. Megadeth Super Collider. Now Megadeth has survived every chaotic phase a band can go through. Breakups, rehab, endless lineup changes, you name it, they done it. And right before Super Collider, things were looking actually pretty good for the band. They released the Endgame and the album 13 was also quite solid. And many fans thought, okay, this is the era we will finally surpass Metallica. And then Super Collider dropped and that momentum instantly vanished. And now when I started to think about it, there are so many bands that tried to reach the mainstream in the early 2010s. Now this album completely abandons their thrash metal roots that made them famous, and they instead went full Nickelback style on this one. Clean and rock record, and critics didn't enjoy this one. The wild part is that Dave Mustaine actually wanted to break into the mainstream, and he openly talked about it in the interviews. And it's a bit ironic when you think that Megadeth built their identity on being opposite of the mainstream. They were supposed to be this aggressive and sarcastic part of the Big Four, but Dave did quite a good job here, obviously. To make things even stranger, they decided to add autotune to David's voice, which truly creates some awkward moments when you listen to some of their songs. Even the big songs on this album feel completely flat. The title track Super Collider and their cover of Thin Lizzy's Cold Sweat do not bring anything memorable to this album. And then David Draymond comes up on this album. I mean, this guy has his greasy fingerprints on every disappointing album in the early 2010s. His track, Dance in the Rain, might be one of the most unintentionally hideous tracks I have ever heard. In the end, it's an album that nobody likes to revisit, and for a very good reason, and it sits around 40 out of a 100 score. Silence. Silence. Oh, not this one. Now, I still remember about hearing Mitch Locker death and I'm thinking, okay, the band had a good run and they went out with a catalog that truly defined an entire genre, like The Cleansing, No Time to Bleed and Black Crown, albums that are brutal, iconic and impossible to ignore. And their sound and style almost felt like a blueprint to every band that came afterward. So when you decided to continue with Eddie, I honestly thought, alright, let's see what happens. And those early singers weren't bad, and I think that the band respectfully moved on. And then came their self-titled album that was basically shit. And the internet immediately caught fire. They basically removed everything that made silence, well, silence. There were no blast beats, no breakdowns, and no suffocating aggression. Instead of the deathcore band you're used to, you're now listening to alternative nu metal band. But the problem wasn't the experimenting, but it was how quickly and extreme it was done. Nobody expected this. The song Doris became a cultural punchline, and it was memed all over the place. And people quickly started to call them a rip-off band of Deftones and Korn. Even if Eddie, an incredible deathcore vocalist, felt very uncomfortable because they decided to include clean vocals and he isn't very good at that. The old fans completely lost it, but instead of saying, hey, we tried something new, they were trying to tell the fans, hey, open your minds to our new music and don't be like this, which completely backfired even more. And the dislike ratio on YouTube turned into one of the biggest memes of all time. And the dislike ratio on this video is nuts. It sits around 29,000 likes and 45,000 dislikes, which is... Commercially, the album completely tanked, and longtime supporters of the band simply called it a too big of a change done too quickly. Battery Octagon. Battery is one of the most important names when it comes to extreme metal. Their early albums definitely helped the creation of black metal and later shaped the Viking metal genre. Corton didn't just influence the genre, he basically invented the half of it. And when you're dealing with Battery's catalog, you're dealing with some of the most important stuff created in the metal genre. And then you got Octagon. This album came at a strange moment in his career. Allegedly he was hard under the influence at the time, but he was also experimenting quite a lot at this time, and many fans felt like he was directionless. And with Octagon that was released in 1995, instead of pushing boundaries, he ended up releasing something that didn't sound like him. It sounded almost like a dead thrash metal band from the 80s. Without that magic that Battery had to his albums, and the production was the first thing that people noticed it's constantly described as amateurish and very muddy. The guitars were shallow, dry, and the vocals sound distant, almost like he's singing out of a barrel, but not in a very cool basement style, but more like it just feels off. The atmosphere is also completely gone, and there is no epic Viking metal scope you will usually get in his albums, like in Hammerheart or Twilight of the Gods. And the songwriting didn't help it either. The lyrics are some of the most simplest you will find in his whole catalog. And because Battery has such beasts of album, the drop in quality here feels quite huge. And that's why Battery landed this chart, and I mean the scores were around 2 out of 5 stars. Metallica Lulu. It's almost unhinged how bad this album is. I won't pretend I knew about this album before going to this Iceberg, but once I actually sit down and listen to it, I was impressed how much it sucked. Metallica doesn't need any introduction, and they are one of the biggest metal bands out there. And before I start to researching stuff for this Iceberg chart, I definitely debated around including Saint Anger or Load/Reload. But then I discovered Lulu and suddenly the choice was obvious. Now, this isn't just a new Metallica album, this was a full collaboration with Lou Reed. And Lou Reed is an experimental art rock icon behind the Velvet Underground. And on paper this sounds very interesting. A legendary metal band combined with a legendary avant artist. It could be a weird and cool collaboration, but it wasn't. Instead, we got one of the most infamous album releases ever. The problem was that Metallica and Lou operated on two separate planets, and nobody of them even tried to meet in the middle. Musically, it is slow, repetitive, and strangely lifeless somehow. It's like Metallica is warming up in the background while Lou is just reading some things out of a paper. His vocal delivery on this album is spoken, and there is that moment that defined this whole album. James screaming the line "I am Table" was memed all over the place, and they even made a whole song structured only about this line. Even James later admitted he was not sure what Lou was trying to do, and Lou responded by calling the Metallica fans simple-minded, and I don't want to debate that now, but... And the album only scored 40 points of a 100, and in the end, Lulu is remembered as this trainwreck collaboration between two great artists. And yes, you're a table. A Lost Prophets, Start Something. Okay, this is definitely cheating. I'm not only putting Start Something on this list, but also their whole discography. Now, let me explain why every single album from them become unlistenable overnight, at least in my personal opinion. Lost Prophets were definitely huge in the 2000s. Start Something, Liberation, Transmission, and The Betrayed, these albums were definitely everywhere, and over the years they gained a quite loyal fan base. Some of them were even too dedicated, if you know what I mean. But the band sold out shows and they had their place in the alternative rock scene. And you'll probably know where we are heading, and there is no point of dragging this out, because 2013 happened, because their singer Ian was arrested and later convicted for crimes so severe that it shook up the whole music industry. And the nature of these crimes were so extreme that it poisoned their whole discography because of it. And the main issue now is not the sound quality, but it's the association with him. First of all, people didn't want to financially support him by buying his albums, or emotionally engage with anything that is connected with, even though the band members were innocent and they formed another band called No Devotion. They openly said they will never play their songs ever again. And honestly, I get it, because I can listen to any of their songs without having Ian in the background and his deeds. And if you want to know more about this, I made a whole video about that. And a fair warning, it's quite disturbing, so just a heads up. So yeah, putting an entire discography on this list is maybe cheating, but this situation is quite unique and extreme, and his actions went far beyond normal rockstar controversy. Iron Maiden, Virtual 11. I heard if you don't like Iron Maiden, that Eddie will become your paralysis demon. Let's be real for a second. I know many people who respect Iron Maiden, but they're not into Iron Maiden. And I'm definitely one of them. One of the problems for me is because of their huge library. I just can't get into, even if I own some vinyls from them, and From Fear to Eternity gave me a great overview of their library. The first time I heard Virtual 11, I thought that Eddie was sanitized on this album. Iron Maiden felt like a band that was completely unstoppable. Decades of iconic albums, songs, legendary tours, and the most loyal fan base out there. But by the late 90s, things were a bit different. And I simply think by the time they were just simply tired. This was the second album with Blaze Bayley, and the timing couldn't be worse. Grunge has taken over and nu metal was rising. And traditional metal was not popular as it used to be, and with Bruce gone, basically Maiden tried to rebuild their image from scratch. And the promotion of the album didn't help either, because they tied the album's release with a football PC game, which made the fans even more confused. It didn't look like a new bold chapter, but more that the band was just surviving. Stephen Thomas from AllMusic summed it up perfectly. On the surface, there is nothing terribly wrong with the record, as it delivers all the crunching riffs and demonic horrors of their best records. The problem is that there is nothing memorable about the hooks, riffs or songs, and there is little visceral energy to the music or production. As a result, it sounds lifeless to all but the most devoted fans. And Blaze ends up sounding like a faceless voice in this album. The only song worth remembering of this album is The Clansman. It's a song that has that classic huge build-up and the progression we love about Iron Maiden, but then again, when Bruce took the song over, it sounded even more better. Some critics gave this album 0 stars from 5, and the average Metacritic score was around 30 out of 100, which is a massive drop for a band like Iron Maiden. Linkin Park, One More Line. I know that many people have Chester in high regards, and it's not without a reason. And I also get that Chester was struggling with his mental health around the time he was releasing this album, but we can't turn our heads away and say that Warm on Light is a good album. Now, Linkin Park was one of the biggest 2000s rock bands on the planet, almost carrying the nu metal genre single-handedly, and they served as a gateway to metal to many fans around the world, and over time they sold over 100 million records worldwide. And yeah, the band was experimenting with different styles of music over time, but they never abandoned their core sound, which made them famous in the first place until this album. With No More Light, they shifted their style completely. They fully abandoned the nu metal roots. There were no heavy guitars, no aggression, nothing that could give the album a slight edge. It was just a glossy, radio-friendly pop album. And remember, we are not looking at the album from a pop listener perspective, but more of someone who is into metal. And looking at from this perspective how you abandon your core audience, this is a bottom tier entry, because you completely abandon the people who made you famous in the first place and loved your stuff. And if you're thinking I'm shitting on Chester, I'm definitely not. It's just criticizing the album and the direction the band had at the time. His performance of this album was alright for a pop singer, I think, but many of his true loyal fans didn't appreciate this album at all, and they sounded like they're having an identity crisis on this one. Critics and fans described this music as bland, generic and unoriginal pop music that could be made by every mainstream artist. And the lead single with Kiara became the focal point why this album was bad. But hey, maybe you enjoyed this one, I don't know, I didn't. Metacritic this time gave this album a 46 out of 100, with some scores going even lower, giving it 2 out of a 5-star rating. That's how bad things were. Guns N' Roses, Chinese Democracy. You all heard about Guns N' Roses, and we don't need an introduction here, I think. Their highs were insane. They filled the biggest stadiums around the world, and Appetite for Destruction was the best-selling album of all time. And even now, decades into their career, they're selling out stadiums. But we can't ignore the 2008 disaster. And oh boy, they delivered with this one. Now, Chinese Democracy wasn't just an album, it's more like a meme. Because it spent around 15 years in production and burned to $30 million of budget, and it basically became a punchline over the years for something that will never happen. And by the time they finally decided to drop this album, Guns N' Roses weren't Guns N' Roses anymore. It was just Axl Rose with a rotating cast of musicians, because Slash wasn't on this record and the chemistry the band had was simply gone. So a lot of fans thought of this album more as a Axl Rose solo project than a Guns N' Roses album. The problem is that Chinese Democracy isn't unlistenable, but after a decade of build-up people expected a masterpiece, and instead they got an album that was overproduced and overpolished and didn't sound like Guns N' Roses, and a lot of fans describe this album as Axl Rose trapped inside his own head for a decade, and that's a perfect summary, I think. It's very ambitious but still messy. Commercially it spiked in the beginning, but when the hype wore off it quickly plummeted, receiving mixed reviews across the board, with some critics even giving a 3 out of a 10 star. And the expectation completely destroyed this album in my opinion. And the reason why this album is on the list is quite obvious, because there is a huge gap between the highest peak and this record. Black Sabbath, Forbidden. And now let's go to the most painful entry on this whole list. Now, Black Sabbath invented heavy metal, and they're one of my favorite bands. And I almost had a chance to see them live in 2020. This was the 50 years of rock and roll tour with Judas Priest and Black Sabbath. But then Corona hit, then we waited 1 year, then the second year, and then it was completely cancelled. And I never got a chance to see them live. And that's my story with Black Sabbath. But have you ever wondered what is critically the worst album from Black Sabbath? We all know that the Ozzy era was incredible, and so was Dios. But the Tony Martin era is quite unappreciated. Headless Cross was definitely fantastic. But then we have Forbidden, an album that needs to be buried and forgotten. This record is the lowest point of their whole career. Even Tony Iommi said that this album wasn't good at all. The first problem that everybody brings up is the production. For reasons that no one truly understands, Sabbath decided to evolve Ice-T from Ernie C and Body Count, and this resulted they included weird industrial and hip-hop elements, a style that definitely not fits with Black Sabbath. If you listen to the album, the guitars sound very thin and the drums are very plastic and hollow. Now Tony Martin's vocals are amazing, super underrated, but in this album they feel quite misplaced, like he was dropped in the wrong project. And the worst part of this whole album is probably Ice-T guest appearance on the Illusion of Power. Fans absolutely hated it. It felt so awkward and forced, it's just wrong. And it came off that Black Sabbath was just trying to copy the trend in the 90s. And even Martin later said he never believed in a rap Sabbath record. And he was definitely right. And seeing Forbidden as the final chapter to such a big band like Black Sabbath for over a decade looks miserable. I mean, there are some tiny flashes of quality like Can't Get Close Enough, which is a quite solid track. But it doesn't save the album, and it doesn't hit the mark from a band that basically invented heavy metal. And the average rating for this album was 1 out of a 5 star, 1 for Black Sabbath. And seeing a band that defined a whole genre falling so low feels surreal. But it happened, and it's a good reminder that abandoning your core audience is never a good idea. And with that said, we are at the end of this video, but it doesn't mean your visit needs to end here, because I have a list with over 20 icebergs just waiting for you. The playlist is in the description. Also, I wanna know which albums I have missed, and I'm always open for new iceberg ideas, so drop your suggestions down below. Thanks for watching, remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video, share your thoughts, and until the next deep dive, stay curious. Bye.